Good afternoon. Today I will be talking about one of the most important parts of American history, and that is the American Revolutionary War. Now, the war can be traced back to the French and Indian War, which took place between 1754 and 1763, which is why it's also known as the Seven Years' War. Now, the war was fought over conflicting territorial claims between the French and British in the Ohio River Valley. The British won the war, and this resulted in basically the expulsion of the French in North America. Now, after the war, the British enforced the Proclamation of 1763, which prohibited the Americans from moving west of the Appalachian Mountains. Now, this enraged the Americans as they had just won a war, and population was beginning to increase within the colonies, and they needed more land to populate. But they were stuck on the east coast of America. And because of the war, King George III and Great Britain as a whole were very deep in debt because of all the expenses that they spent during the war on soldiers, food, weapons, and those sorts of things. So, Great Britain began to enforce taxes without the consent of the colonists, which the colonists would later use to their advantage to bring up arms against the British Empire by saying that there was taxation without representation. And the first of these acts that were enforced were the Currency Acts of 1764, which prohibited the Americans from basically creating their own currency within the colonies. The next act would be the Stamp Act of 1765, which required the colonists to pay a tax on printed documents, various licenses, and other goods. Now, the colonists, of course, greatly enraged, greatly angered by this act and the tax without representation, basically. Next would come the Townshend Acts of 1767, which authorized Parliament to issue taxes on imports such as glass, lead, paint, paper, tea, and those sorts of things. Now, British soldiers would have to be brought into Boston to prevent an uprising, basically, because of the anger that the colonists were experiencing. Because of these acts, along would come the Boston Massacre, in which tension over the presence of British troops in Boston would lead to the first episode in the colonies that would result in loss of life between the colonists and the British. And in this event, 4 Bostonians were killed when the British fired into an angry mob. After this would come the Boston Tea Party, which took place on December 16th, 1773, in which the Sons of Liberty, which were led by Samuel Adams, planned to show Parliament how they felt about the Tea Act. They boarded the British ship named Dartmouth that was docked in the Boston harbor, dressed up as Indians, and dumped the entire load of tea on the boat into the water, resulting in a loss of hundreds, maybe thousands of dollars worth of tea. And, of course, as a result of the Boston Tea Party, the British would enforce the Intolerable Acts, which would consist of several acts. The first of these being the Boston Port Act, which closed the port of Boston until the Dutch East India Company had been repaid for the destroyed tea. Second was the Massachusetts Government Act, which put the government of Massachusetts almost entirely under direct British control. Third is the Administration of Justice Act, which allowed royal officials to be tried in Britain if the king felt it necessary for fair justice. Fourth would be one of the most famous acts, the Quartering Act, which ordered the colonists to provide lodging for British soldiers. And then there was the Quebec Act, which expanded British territory in Canada and guaranteed the free practice of Roman Catholicism. After the Intolerable Acts would come the First Continental Congress, in which 55 delegates representing 12 of the 13 colonies, excluding Georgia, would debate over what to do because of the British coming down on them. Now, the colonists did petition against King George III with the Olive Branch petition, where they basically told the king that they were being taxed without representation, and the king did not listen to them, basically, and told them that they were in open and avowed rebellion, and didn't listen. And after the First Continental Congress, down the road came the battles of Lexington and Concord, in which the first shots of the American Revolution were fired. And this would begin the American Revolution. Now, as a result of the American Revolution, America would become its own nation, become free, and eventually down the road become one of the great superpowers in the world. And that is the American Revolution. Thank you.